His Excellency, the Vice President of the Republic of Mauritius, Mr. Vayapuri, Dr. the Honorable Mohammed Anwar Hasnu, Minister of Health and the Quality of Life, Honorable Ministers, Honorable Parliamentary Private Secretaries, Honorable African Ministers of Health and Education, Mr. Stangenberg-Haverkamp, Deputy Director General of UNESCO, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished scientists, guests, Dr. Yusuf Hamid of Sipla, India. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm really pleased to welcome you all to Mauritius and to this third edition of the UNESCO-MERCK Africa Research Summit. I thank the organizers for this valuable partnership with the Government of Mauritius to contribute to building research capacity in Africa. We're also pleased to have with us Professor Frank Stangenberg-Haverkamp, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Merck Foundation, and Dr. Rasha Kelej, CEO of the Merck Foundation. I'd like to welcome the senior officials of the international NGOs, the international and African researchers, and of course, our young students, especially these talented young women and men who will help us build on our achievements, learn from our mistakes, while practicing the highest standard of scientific excellence needed to accelerate sustainable development on the African continent. Ladies and gentlemen, UNESCO-MERCK Africa Research Summit, MARS, is a valuable opportunity for all those engaged and interested in health research in Africa to learn about the full spectrum of groundbreaking scientific research currently underway and prepare for the road ahead in Africa's development as an international hub for research excellence and scientific innovation. Conducting the third edition of UNESCO MARS in Mauritius is valuable for us as it complements our national strategy to promote scientific research, empowering women and youth in STEM, and our Ministry of Health focused strategy on improving cancer research and access to cancer care. It is because the future of innovation in science and technology is in the hands of our youth that I wish to dedicate this third edition of the UNESCO-MERCK Africa Research Summit to the young students who have joined us today. Let us give them all round a big round of applause. And I would like to take this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to say a few words about Mauritius and the importance we attach to science, technology, and innovation for our and Africa's current and future prosperity. Mauritius, as you know, is a small island developing state, and we have a history of colonialism that ranged from brief visits 100 years ago by people of what we now call the Middle East, followed by former colonial powers like Portugal, and in more recent centuries by the Dutch, the French, and finally the British. Since gaining its independence in 1968, Mauritius has shown exceptional progress on multiple fronts. Although we are a comparatively small country, we are leading in terms of many economic, social, and environmental indicators. We were for a long highly dependent on sugarcane cultivation with its dominance on low-wage, low-skill, backbreaking jobs. Mauritius has become, across the years, a developmental state with well-educated and diverse society with a robust and knowledge-intensive economy. Through a focus on sound, people-centered policies, we are now often taken as example, not just for Africa, but for the world, in terms of good governance, as well as a productive financial sector, high-end tourism, and gender equality, to name but a few. We also have a proud history of, and we remain, abundantly multicultural, a living laboratory for societal benefits that accrue from true inclusion. Still, we in Africa face considerable challenges to the health and the well-being of our people. Our continent is home to 15% of global population, but produces only 3% of global GDP, while carrying 25% of the disease burden. And Africa accounts for just 2% of world research output, 1.3% of research spending, and 0.1% of patents. Ladies and gentlemen, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals present an optimistic picture of what the world can look like in 2030. But Africa has far to go to reach these goals, more particularly those relating to poverty and disease. Our future will depend on our ability to prioritize investment in research and development to solve some of the toughest health and development challenges the world has ever faced. In addition to the human development imperative, our investment in science and technology will also be pivotal to our economic health. When it comes to market competition, we must also reckon with the fact that Africa must catch up with other rapidly growing economies of Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. But I'm confident that a greater frontal push in science, technology, and innovation will be key to sustaining the African rising narrative, both now and in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, it is particularly timely that we are meeting today to discuss the latest advances in cancer research and vaccine development. Our deliberations are important because as the middle class rises in Africa, so are the afflictions of abundance. Death due to non-communicable diseases threaten to overtake death due to communicable diseases in sub-Saharan Africa in the decades to come. In this region of the world, NCDs account for just 28% of mortality as recently as 10 years ago. Yet, the US Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality estimates that by 2030, the NCDs, prominently cancers, heart diseases, and type 2 diabetes, will account for 46% of mortality in sub-Saharan Africa. The comparable change in incidence of NCD mortality in the wealthiest region of the world are just a minor increase of 2% from 87% of mortality in 2008 to 89% projected in 2030. Of course, there is good news in these figures. The incidence of communicable diseases in sub-Saharan Africa is decreasing, both in the absolute and proportionally. In fact, life expectancy at birth increased in sub-Saharan Africa an outstanding 50% from 40 years to 60 years between 1960 and 2015, despite the thankfully momentary decline in life expectancy suffered in 1990s as a result of the AIDS epidemic. This success stories, ladies and gentlemen, has been in great part due to the focus and dedication of government, scientists, public health officials worldwide who brought their resources to contain the spread of AIDS with all its accompanying negative impacts on economic and social well-being. But the growing incidence of non-communicable diseases in Africa is also cause for concern. As Africa becomes more industrialized and people live longer, they suffer from those diseases and conditions already experienced in overwhelming numbers in the industrial world. So, what can we learn from the lessons of experience from industrial countries as they've been confronted for decades of increased type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, stroke, certain cancer, infertility, and complications in pregnancy? There are several messages that can be gleaned from these converging events. First, we can and must take advantage of the accumulated experience in these critical areas and over 2 generations, disease that is in great part a result of poor nutrition and unhealthy living has overtaken people in the US to the point that as of 2014, more than 38% of individuals over 20 are obese, and an outstanding 70% were at least overweight. Those numbers are just now starting to decrease due to concerted public health and education measures, as well as important advances in pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical treatments. We must therefore seize upon the opportunity and build our capacity to deal with these threats through the power of partnerships. Second, we can also extrapolate from African success stories in the technology sectors where entrepreneurs have been able to take advantage of the relative lack of infrastructure to leapfrog directly to better market-based solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, a few years ago, we all witnessed the challenges posed by Ebola, which threatened to become a disastrous global pandemic. To fight Ebola, government, international health agencies, and private foundations stepped up the effort, provided major resources, and improved condition coordination to combat deadly disease and contain its spread. However, because non-communicable diseases plays out more slowly and not transmitted from person to person, they tend to invoke less urgency and evoke fewer glaring headlines. It is our obligation to see the threats posed by non-communicable diseases for what they are, and to mobilize our resources to address it in a manner that is proportional to the severity of the challenge. This is the premise of a new alliance called CARI, the Coalition for African Research and Innovation. CARI is a coalition of government, universities, foundations, NGOs, and pharmaceutical firms, including Merck, who have come together to build world-class research and development infrastructure in Africa. It exists to accelerate scientific breakthrough in Africa to help more Africans lead better lives. CARI's approach is two-pronged. First, to increase investment in research and development on the continent, and second, to decrease the fragmentation of existing research by linking people to one another, to ideas, to resources, including funding, together with all the other resources that make up robust science and technology ecosystems for mentorship to policy advice. CARI's goal is to catalyze a highly coordinated, well-funded, innovative African research development community. It will convene stakeholders to work together towards commitment in new ways to meet short-term health and development objectives while building long-term capacity in various fields of science. This collaboration will be driven by African priorities, and it will include African governments, African development organizations, the African private sector, African and global philanthropists, and the African global industry. The ultimate vision of CARI is to create a momentum that makes science and innovation a central part of the public discourse in Africa. One of the tools that CARI will employ to raise the level of political and public engagement and commitment is rigorous documentation of the long-term benefits and investment to the economies of the African nations. This will be critical to enlist governments and others to regard research and development not as an expense, but rather as an investment in economic development and well-being. Thus, CARI is gathering public and private investment, focusing initially on clinical and translational research to build a dramatically scaled-up infrastructure for science on our continent. It will also ensure the right governance conditions to enable and attract public and private investment in R&D in Africa, an essential element to the maintenance of sustainable initiative. With seed funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, and the US National Institute of Health, its long-term ambitions are to reinforce every step of the research ladder so that opportunities for world-class training and satisfying jobs in research and manufacturing of pharmaceuticals are attractive in Africa as they are elsewhere in the world. CARI also intends to exploit an opening to reverse African brain drain. It will work to create brain gain, or what I like to call an increase in brain circulation. Why shouldn't Africa attract promising students and postdoc for their education and training in the way that North America and Europe had since the 20th century? Ladies and gentlemen, our summit today is an essential building block as we seek to build a sustainable infrastructure to boost world-class training and scientific productivity here in Africa. I'm confident that through a commitment to scientific excellence, increased investment in R&D, and the power of partnership, we can improve the everyday lives of African citizens. We can and we must rise to the multifaceted challenge. Our ability to create a sustainable future for ourselves is not optional. It is existential. There's an African proverb that says, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. I urge you all, and especially the students to whom this summit is dedicated, to bring your seedlings and your shovels and let us plant that tree together for a better tomorrow. Thank you for your attention.